There are many things in our lives that can take the place of God. Last week we talked about mammon taking the place of God. There are even people in the church who openly prioritize the pursuit of wealth in God's name. So we must be aware. Last week we have mentioned about Jesus' teaching for both rich and poor believers. So today we continue to look at another competitor of God from the Bible. So we look at the scripture written in Matthew chapter 10, verse 37. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. So that is what Jesus said when he sent the 12 disciples to declare the message of the kingdom of heaven. Jesus told the 12 disciples, you will meet many people and see many different reactions when you preach the message. So one response is that some people deify their relationship with people to the point of competing with Jesus. Here are a few things to note about this passage. First of all, I must clarify that Jesus did not teach the disciples to stop loving their parents and children. Jesus clearly taught people to love those around them, even their enemies. So don't take these out of context and say that Jesus teaches people not to love their family. No, there's no such thing. So do not mistreat the people around you and say that because you love Jesus more. That is wrong. And secondly, although Jesus mentions only parents and children here, he is really talking about all the people close to us. So it's not limited to just family members, but it also includes all those who have a special relationship and status in our lives. So these can be family, friends, partners, colleagues, spouse, boss, anyone close to us, and anyone who has power over us. So don't think that Jesus is talking about parents and children, and then boyfriend and girlfriend don't count. A wife and husband are excluded. Relatives don't count. No, don't read the Bible searching for loopholes like that. Now, thirdly, being unworthy has a subtle meaning in the original text. Well, it points to the idea of worthiness. It points more to the precondition of having a relationship with Jesus here. Because Jesus is talking about what it really takes to follow him, what it really takes to communion with him, to receive him. So worthiness has that connotation. So it will be clearer if we look at the situation of the early Christians. The disciples who followed Jesus were gradually persecuted more and more after Jesus was crucified, resurrected, and ascended into heaven. In the book of Acts, we read that the religious leaders arrested and flogged the apostles, and they forbade them to preach Jesus and his gospel. After that, they began to kill believers. Also, in the Apostle Paul's experience, we also see that the Gentiles also didn't accept Christians very well. In one case, the whole city went into riot when more and more people became disciples of Jesus. The fact is that these things started from people around the disciples. The persecution started there. Parents stopped their children from following Jesus. Children forbade their parents from following Jesus. The neighbors exposed the fact that they were following Jesus. Their loved ones left them. People around them abandoned them. The disciples were disowned by people dear to them. No one wanted to trade with them. No one wanted to hire them for a job. Sometimes it was because people genuinely thought that they have really gone off track. But more often, it was because having a relationship with a disciple of Jesus would make them an outcast in their own circles too. So it's good to make clear that they have no relationship with any disciples of Jesus. They too would experience such isolation or else. Now, if you loved those around you more than Jesus, what would you choose in that kind of environment? It's a no-brainer, isn't it? You will turn away from the faith and start following Jesus. It's as simple as that. So that's how these words make sense in those areas, in those era. Because the people around you are more important to you if you need to make that kind of decision. So you will make that decision. So when Jesus teaches us to love him more than others, it is a prerequisite. And it is also a direction of sanctification for us. That is something we must work on. This is a common situation we see when we preach the gospel even today. It is still happening in many places around the world where things like that happened. But in our context, I personally feel that even believers and churches do not understand and adhere to this teaching very well. Believers often go against the teachings of Jesus and ignore justice and truth because they love people more than they love God. When some believers break the law and commit sin, but for the sake of love, for the sake of good relationships with these people, most of the time believers and churches want to handle it as lenient as possible. Because of our relationships with these people, we want to let them off the hook, preferably with little to nothing done. We then beautifully say, oh, we are all sinners, so we must love one another. Well, those are true, but it's not true in that sense. But the fact is that things are not handled according to biblical principles. When we do this, we twist the Bible according to our own convenience. For the people we cherish more than God, we twist it for them. And it also proves that we do not know God. The Bible has established discipline for divine purposes, and Jesus personally taught the disciples how to deal with such situations. But there are times when people feel that they are kinder than Jesus. We feel that we are more just and righteous than God, and so we act according to our own will rather than God's will. We purposefully ignore the discipline part of the Bible and conveniently use other parts of the Bible to justify ourselves. But this cannot change the fact that we love people more than we love God. That is why we nullify the truth for them. If you know what Jesus called such people, you will know how serious it really is for God. So does punishing a child means that the parents do not love the child? No. On the contrary, the more we love, the more we exercise discipline. And we're talking about discipline consistent with what the Bible teaches. When we fail to discipline or when we water down discipline, we deny God. And we will only end up harming more people in that way. Of course, overdoing it is unbiblical as well. My observation is that people often overdo it in the lower level and watering it down in the higher level. We must remember that God's discipline is just right. We must beware when we see people adding on to it or lighten the God-ordained discipline according to their own liking. So do not take part in that. There are also people who refuse to respond to God's calling due to their relationship with others. Some follow people more than they follow God. They obey men more than they obey God. So it will be a long video if we elaborate each of them. So there are all sorts of similar situations among believers. But if we trace the root, it is really the deification of relationships that makes relationships take the place of God. This is how relationships become a competitor of God in our lives. Now, have we deified relationships in our lives? Have we turned away from God, away from His truth and righteousness, and away from His calling because of our relationships with someone? This can happen even in the church, and we have to be careful. If you look at Jesus, the closest people to Him were His family and His disciples. We could see in the Gospels that Jesus' family members, especially His brothers, were not very supportive of His ministry when He was ministering. Sometimes they even talk about His ministry and calling sarcastically. But not only did Jesus press on in His calling, He set a good example. 2 weeks ago, I mentioned that Jesus was a wonderful child. Even when He was crucified on the cross, He was making arrangement for His mother. I believe that Jesus was also a good brother. After Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, His brothers finally came to understand the truth. They too became Jesus' disciples. James and Jude were written by Jesus' brothers. You can find it in the Bible. They call themselves a servant of Jesus Christ. If Jesus was a bad brother, then I don't think they can believe in Him. Jesus also did not allow His closest disciples to stop Him from doing the Father's will. This is a lifelong lesson. May God help us to be Christ-like in this season and beyond, that we will not let any relationship in our life to take God's place. That our love for God will compel us to follow Jesus' teachings to love the people around us more.